Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Karl Marx was one of the most well-read people of his time. His influences range from the Bible to Goethe to Shakespeare. These weren't just influences on his prose, but also on his political and even economic thought. Today, my guest argues that Shakespeare had a profound influence on Karl Marx, and that through Karl Marx we learn something about Shakespeare, and through Shakespeare we can learn something about Marxism. My guest is Christian Smith. Christian Smith is an independent researcher based in Berlin. He works in literary criticism and critical theory, and he is the author of the book that we're going to be in conversation about. It's called Shakespeare's Influence on Karl Marx, the Shakespearean Roots of Marxism. He joins me from Berlin. Christian Smith, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm interested, how does one get interested and go down this road of investigating both Shakespeare and Karl Marx, other than you must enjoy some pretty heavy, deep, sometimes difficult reading?
Absolutely, yes. I've been interested in Marxism for a very long time. I've been studying Marxism since 1983. I came to Shakespeare later in my life, around 2001. And when I started reading Shakespeare, I noticed some of the ideas that Shakespeare was registering or representing in the characters and in the plots and imagery in his plays were ideas that Marx had written about in his texts. And so I had this thought that Shakespeare was a Marxist. Now, of course, that thought is backwards. But I did have an excitement about studying the Renaissance because that was a revolutionary period. And in fact, the revolutionary nature of it is that it's the period when this current political and economic system begins. Modernity begins there. Capitalism begins in a very simple way at first, but then it starts developing. And so I thought I wanted to study that. And I went to study with Jonathan Bate, who was at the University of Warwick at the time. He's a Shakespearean. And he told me that my idea, which is that Shakespeare as a Marxist, was anachronistic and I needed to turn it around. So once we turned it around, then we came up with the idea that Marx is a Shakespearean. And then we were off and running.
Tell me about Marx's education as a child.
So Marx was born in 1818 in Trier. And Trier is a very, very old city in the German states. It was Rhineland at the time. Prussia was a dominant power, and it had occupied Rhineland after it pushed the French out in 1815. So he's born in an occupied territory. And his father is a lawyer at the time, a civil servant working for the occupying government in Trier. And then his father's best friend, whose name is Ludwig von Westfalen, he's the top civil servant, the highest paid civil servant there. And so the two of them were very, very well educated men. And Heinrich Marx, Marx's father, taught him some things about the Enlightenment, about law, some languages, taught him also about growing grapes for wine, because they were, what is the word, viticulture, I think, or viticulture. Somebody can correct me on that. And so this is what Marx got from his father. And he was homeschooled until he was 12. But Ludwig von Westphalen, the father's best friend, had what I'm calling a little academy. And in this little academy was von Westphalen's oldest daughter, Jenny, who later becomes Marx's girlfriend and then wife, his fiance and wife, right? And then there's also Marx's older sister and then Jenny's younger brother. So there's 4 children. And Ludwig von Westphalen, who is Enlightenment educated, but he's also a Shakespearean in the sense that in his family, he has some Scottish roots. Also, he came from an area where the Duke of that area was actually the King of England at the time. And so there's this crossover from England over to this part of Germany. And it comes down to Ludwig von Westphalen, and he's teaching these kids literature, and he's teaching them politics, mostly Saint-Simon, socialism. He's teaching them about the Enlightenment. And so this is where Marx first comes across Shakespeare is in this little academy. When he was 12, then he goes into gymnasium. So that's like an honors high school. Yeah. And there he doesn't learn Shakespeare. He learns other literature, but he also learns, Latin and religion and all of that. When he graduates, then he goes to the University of Bonn for a year. And there, one of his teachers is August W. Schlegel, who is one of the greatest Shakespeare translators. So he takes a couple of courses with him, leaves the University of Bonn, goes to the University of Berlin, and that's where he comes under the sway of the Hegelians. Hegel had been dead a few years by the time Marx got there, but he took classes from Edward Gans, who was Hegel's student. And that's where he got in with the left Hegelians. So by this point, by the end of his university education, he's already been educated in German literature, British literature, German philosophy, French philosophy.
Do you know in his early years when he first starts reading Shakespeare, if he's reading it in German, translated into German? And the reason I ask is I have heard, Shakespeare is difficult for us native English speakers to read. If you read other writers of Shakespeare's time, they're actually easier, I have found anyways, easier to read than Shakespeare himself. And I have heard that Shakespeare is easier to understand in a translated language than the actual original English.
It depends on which translation we're talking about. So what we know is that August Schlegel began translating Shakespeare with his wife, Caroline, and his brother, Friedrich, in 1798, 99. They translated about 16 plays, and then they dropped it. And then it was picked up by a poet called Ludwig Tieck. And Tieck is translating with his daughter, Dorothea Tieck, and another guy called von Bodessen. So except for von Bodessen, all of these people I just mentioned are poets. They're all German poets, and they're very good at working, at wordsmithing, And so their translation of Shakespeare, I think, is gorgeous. Most of it is really nice, except for von Bodessen, who was mostly a diplomat, and he did some rush jobs. And that's an interesting thing that shows up later in the book. But it's very beautiful to read. It's also quite hard to read, but it was a mark of culture in Germany at the time to read Shakespeare. The translation finally came out in 1833. And so Marx is a teenager at that point. Before that, we don't know what books they had. We don't know in what language he read it in. We do know that Jenny von Westfalen and Ludwig von Westfalen spoke English and could read Shakespeare in English. And we also know they did Shakespeare readings in their house. The readings would have been in German because it was in Trier. So I'm going to guess that he was hearing Shakespeare both in English and German as a child growing up.
Jenny von Westphalen is important to this story. She would become Karl Marx's wife, lifelong partner. But also, she's a Shakespearean herself, and also quite the intellect herself. Tell me about her in this story that you tell.
Yeah. So she's born to her father's second wife. So there's some trauma in the family with the first wife dying. Her eldest brother ends up becoming one of the most conservative reactionaries in Prussia, like head of security or something like that in Prussia. And interestingly, for some years was following Karl Marx and the family around trying to figure out what they were doing. But Jenny was very beautiful and very intelligent and was fluent in English and in German, and most likely also fluent in French. Certainly later in her life, she became fluent in French. And she probably had a capacity to read Latin and Greek because she writes some of that in her letters. So she's 4 years older than Karl. And if you think about like Karl being 10, she's 14. That's a huge difference. So at 10, she's probably also one of his teachers in the class. We don't know at what point they actually fell in love. We do have a letter in which she says, that time when I looked at you and you looked at me and we couldn't look away, and that sort of thing. But we don't know exactly where that happened. We know that by 1835, they are engaged. to each other. We have some reports from people in her family who became biographers of her later that she was in the Young Germany movement. So she was politically interested early on. We think that her father took her around to see what was going on. And part of what was going on was that Prussia was running an economic sabotage on the area and caused what was called the Moselle wine crisis. And this Moselle wine crisis created famine and severe poverty in the area. Marx ends up writing about it later when he becomes a journalist. So we think she's seen this oppression and exploitation, as a teenager. And she starts studying, but she can't go to school. And she can't go to university. She's not allowed to. At one point,
because she's a woman.
Because she's a woman, yeah. At one point, she becomes engaged to a noble soldier, and she drops him after a couple of months, realizing he's not a good guy. So she was ahead of Marx, and we see in her letters, I have evidence in my first chapter of the book, in her letters, that some of the things that she wrote to him, some of the imagery in her letters, Marx lifts it from the letter and then drops it into some of his writings. And it's some of his more interesting imagery that he got from her. Interestingly, we see this also with like the Wordsworths and a number of other people where the man is writing and he's getting some of the ideas from either his sister or his wife or, somebody like that.
It's interesting. Marx and Jenny then come from well-off families, but they would live a life of poverty mostly. Mm-hmm. Why was that?
Revolution. They theoretically, logically came to a position where they opposed the economic system of the time and the states of the time. And the states would exile them for the writing that Marx was doing. And so they were thrown out of Rhineland, and they ended up in Paris, and they were thrown out of Paris, and then they were in Brussels. And then when the 1848 to 49 revolution breaks open, the Belgian government looks and says, Marx, you did it. It was your fault. You get out of here. He goes to Paris and he slips back into Germany for a while. And then he's thrown out of Germany, arrested at one point, and possibly could have ended his life right there. But interestingly, the Hessian troops that arrested him didn't know who he was. So they let him go. And then he got on a boat and went to London and ended up in London. And the British government said, look, you can write whatever you want. We don't care as long as you don't overthrow our government, But the other answer to that is that Marx never produced a commodity that he could sell. His books did not sell well at the time. And what he was writing about, they were just not going to be bestsellers, right? Also, he never worked for anybody. He didn't have a job. But at moments he was, getting paid to write for the New York Daily Tribune. He was getting paid, I think, like £1 an article or something. But he never had employment, so he wasn't selling his labor power. Yeah, so they ended up living in poverty most of their lives. They would do a little bit better off when they got like inheritance money, but he was always in debt.
Like every now and then, a lump sum would come their way, but
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, one story that's funny about that is that the mom, he kept asking his mother, who he did not have a great relationship with, for some money from the inheritance, which the dad left. But before she died, he would ask for the money. And she's like, oh, all right already. So she sent him a large sum of money to Belgium. The money, anything that comes in, of course, was seen by the police. And the police thought that the mom was sending him money to buy weapons for the revolution. And they went to the mother's house, nearly arrested her. And you can imagine she's thinking, oh, my God, I finally sent him some money, and the police are coming to my house, thinking that I sent it for weapons.
So Marx frequently would quote Shakespeare from one of his plays in his writings. Is that how you see the connection of Marx to Shakespeare, or does Marx specifically ever write about Shakespeare?
So it's multi-layered. There's a lot to it. So the story that we've just been talking about so far, the formative education in Shakespeare, is the first part of it. Then when he starts writing, he uses Shakespeare's images and ideas as a kind of a sandbox to play with his own ideas. One of the first things Marx tried to write was a novel called Scorpion and Felix. And it's laden with Shakespearean ideas, plot turns, and stuff like that. It was never finished. It was never published. But you can see him playing as a writer in a sandbox in there. Then when he starts writing his journalism, he is quoting Shakespeare, so that's part of it. And one of the books that's a precedent to my book is S.S. Prower's, I think it's 1978 book called Karl Marx and World Literature, where Prower is saying, yes, look, he's quoting Shakespeare all over the place. What Prower didn't get is that Shakespeare was a formative influence, because not only is he quoting Shakespeare, but he's using plot turns from Shakespeare's plays into the persuasive argument that he's writing. He's taking some of the skeletal plot of the play and using it in the arguments. He's also taking ideas from Shakespeare, and not just from Shakespeare, but from Shakespeare as they come through, say, Heinrich Heine, or through Goethe, or other authors. And it's in that sense, there's one more part to it, but it's in that sense that I'm saying it's deeper than just a quotation. Now, I've got one other part to this, and that's where we get a little bit psychoanalytic. And it's what I call a deep allusion. So there are times when he's writing, Marx is writing, and there's something he says, and you think, that sounds literary. And then you back up and you start to think about it. Where might this have come from? And then you start to see kind of the mist clearing away from a mountain, and what you see is one of Shakespeare's plays. And this is where like King Lear comes in, or The Merchant of Venice, or Hamlet, Henry IV, Part 1. These plays come in there. He's alluding to them, and I'm not sure that he knows he's alluding to them. And my understanding of that is that when he read those plays, the imagery, the plot, what was happening was traumatic to him. He felt it as traumatic, like gouging Gloucester's eyes out, or Falstaff almost being killed on the battlefield. Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet. Yeah. So as a child, it's hitting him as a traumatic image. And that's good literature. I mean, good literature should really hit us hard, in spite of all the books that are being banned today in American schools, but it should really hit us hard. And he's carrying that throughout his life, and then it's showing up when he sees this non-fictional trauma going on in censorship and the counter-revolution, and people being thrown in jail and people being killed. That's when it's showing up. And I think that it just got into his bone. It got into his bone marrow.
We learn from stories. And these were some
Absolutely.
of the earliest stories that he was learning.
Yeah, we don't just learn from them, but they affect us in a way that is. And when I use the word traumatic, I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. I mean it hits us, and then we carry that hit. And when we see something else that is associated to that, so for example, at one point he talks about cutting the hair and gouging the eyes out with a sharp item, and he's getting his articles back from the censor in Cologne. And the censor is literally taking and cutting parts of the articles out. He's feeling that cutting. And that's why I say that he writes the Shakespearean scene in which the character is getting cut.
Are there plays that are more influential, show up more often than others?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. King Lear is one of them. The Merchant of Venice, especially. The Merchant of Venice is what's called in Shakespeare studies a problem play. It's quite a complex play. Many productions try to swing it one way or the other. At the beginning,
I heard it's both a comedy and a drama.
A comedy and a tragedy. That's why it's a problem play.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on which character you're working with, right? So if you think, oh, that's great, Bassanio wins in the end and he gets the girl, he gets Portia, they get married and they start having babies, then that's a comedy, and the court goes on. If what you see is that in the end, Shylock, who has been the exploited Jew all along, gets his religion cut out at the end. Yeah, so he loses the court case. And his body is literally given over, his life is given over to the merchant, to Antonio, to do with what he wants. And Antonio says, fine, I'm not going to kill you, but from this day forward, you will be a Christian. You will convert. And, in some of the productions, you see Shylock just go off like he's dead. He's dead. By taking his Jewishness, they have taken his life away. And yet, Shylock is trying to act according to the new economics, right? Shylock says, okay, here's a contract. Here's the bond. You lost it. What does it say in the contract? It says I get a pound of flesh from wherever I want. I'm going to take it from around your heart. And the state comes in and says, have you no mercy? And Shylock says, this is your laws. This is your new jurisprudence. And I think what Shakespeare's doing there is he's registering the shock of the new economic system. At the time that Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, the shock was not hitting everybody. Today, when finance capital runs the world brutally, we can fully understand the shock of the new economic system. And that's what Marx is picking up on in The Merchant of Venice.
Marx was Jewish, too.
Absolutely. Both his parents were Jewish when he was born. So he has an older brother, and his brother died. Right after his brother died, the father converted, not because the brother died, but because he couldn't work in the government as a Jew. So when Napoleon was in control of Rhineland, Jews had more rights. After 1815, the Prussians came in, thoroughly anti-Semitic. Jews lost their rights. So Marx had to convert. But the mother, who is the daughter of a rabbi, she said, I am not converting. And she did not convert until her father died. So when Marx was born, his mother was Jewish, his father was Jewish, he was Jewish. But he was baptized Protestant.
Is this significant? I mean, because when we think of Marx, I think we think of atheism, obviously. But of course, being Jewish is more than just being religious.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, culturally, we don't know how much cultural Judaism was going on in the Marx household. Like, we don't know if he knew any Yiddish. We don't know what they observed. We do know that his daughter, Eleanor Marx, who is now growing up in the last half of the 19th century in London, discovered her Jewishness. And at one point she said, I am a Jewess, and she started to learn more about it. But we do know that Marx was aware of the exploitation of Jews, of the historical anti-Semitic narrative. But it's also significant because there's some trauma in there. By the time Marx is growing up, the mother is the only person left in the family who's Jewish. But she has to take care of Karl Marx. He's kind of on the other side of the barricade, in a sense, right, of this historical anti-Semitic barricade, right? Something was going on there. We don't know what, but we know they did not have a good relationship later. The other thing we know about Marx is that even though politically he was always in favor of rights for everyone, including Jews, Marx used imagery from the anti-Semitic narrative in his works. So much so that at times you have to say, this is anti-Semitic. This conclusion you're writing here, this image you're writing here is full-on anti-Semitic. You cannot say, oh, well, that's what he was thinking at the time. No, he's contributing to it at the time. So he had a very complex and troubled relationship with his own Judaism.
That's interesting. And the Merchant of Venice, there's been a debate about the Merchant of Venice itself, of whether or not it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, exactly. And Marx uses the Merchant of Venice both in anti-Semitic manners, like to make fun of someone and calling him Shylock. He also talks about the capitalists as being like Shylocks, the Prussian Shylocks as well. But then he flips it around and he uses Shylock as the person who is exploited. Sometimes Shylock stands for the working class in Marx, and sometimes he stands for the capitalists. And I think part of what's going on here is that Marx correctly picks up on this dialectical turning that Shakespeare has written into the play.
Because that's what Shakespeare's doing. Yeah. Because that's what Shakespeare's doing. He's presenting them both ways.
That's what I would say. I mean, we can't say what Shakespeare was doing, but as a Shakespeare critic, that's how I would teach it to my students. Yeah.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation about William Shakespeare and his play's influence on Karl Marx. Our guest is Christian Smith. Christian Smith is an independent researcher. He joins us from Berlin. He works in literary criticism and critical theory, and he is the author of the book that we are in conversation about called Shakespeare's Influence on Karl Marx, the Shakespearean Roots of Marxism. I do find that chat we just had about The Merchant of Venice interesting, especially about the shock of a new economy taking hold. Is that the biggest lesson that Karl Marx got from Merchant of Venice?
Yes, I think with the Merchant of Venice, that's one of the biggest lessons he got from there. You had asked earlier, what were the other big plays?
Yeah.
Another one is Hamlet, obviously. And for many reasons, because Germans have always struggled with what's called the Hamlet-Frage, the Hamlet question. And the question is, what's eating Hamlet? What's the problem with Hamlet? Why is he taking 4 hours of our time to revenge? Okay. Now, it's a wonderful 4 hours because there's so much philosophy in there. There's so many wonderful lines in there. Okay. But what's he doing? And German poets and literary critics and philosophers, almost every single one of them, they have to weigh in on the matter. What's going on with Hamlet? Okay. And so the way that Marx weighs in on it is the following. The ghost of Hamlet, so Hamlet's father, is the hidden political consciousness, the hidden class consciousness, the hidden revolutionary consciousness. And what it's doing is it's moving underneath the floorboards of the stage. If you remember in one of the scenes in Hamlet, Hamlet sees the ghost, and then he talks to the ghost, and he comes back, and he talks to the soldier and his friend Horatio. And he says, all right, he says, you have to swear that you're not going to tell anybody what we saw here, that we saw the king. Right? And underneath the floorboards of the stage, the ghost, so the actor playing the ghost, will yell out, swear. And all the characters get scared, and they run to another part of the stage. And then he says, okay, swear. And he puts his sword down, right? But the ghost has moved under the stage again to where they were. And he says, swear. And Hamlet says, old mole, the animal, mole, that can work in the earth so fast. Okay. This is picked up by Marx. This is the revolution. It's our consciousness. It's working underground. And there's a certain point at which it's going to come up out of the ground. And that's when we take action. And we are Prince Hamlet, attempting to figure out what to do here. Obviously, the revenge is going to be against capitalism when we overthrow it. This is how Marx is understanding this. And you're going to see Hamlet, it's the second most quoted character. The first is Henry IV, which is it's Falstaff, which is a special situation I can talk about later. But Hamlet is the second most quoted play in Marx, and it has to do with that, the revolution burrowing underground in our world.
Well, tell me about Falstaff. Everybody loves Falstaff. A very
Falstaff
humorous character in Henry I, IV. Is he in Henry V? I can't quite remember.
So Falstaff is in Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. He's also dying in Henry V. Falstaff is at one level hilarious, but he's also he's a bad guy also, and he flips back and forth between the two, right? But he also gets treated poorly by the real bad guy of the whole thing, of the whole Henriade, which is the guy that becomes Henry V, so Prince Hal. Right? So Marx is working a little bit with this. But what happens with Falstaff, and the reason why we hear so much Falstaff in Marx, is a particular text called Herr Faute. Following the 1848 to 49 revolutions, the states turned counter-revolutionary. So especially France, and this becomes the Second Empire, right? Napoleon III. Okay. So Napoleon III is paying people to slander the different revolutionaries. And a guy called Herr Faute gets paid to slander Karl Marx. Well, he picked on the wrong guy because Marx wrote this huge book called Herr Faute, and it's the most Shakespearean book, but it's not just Shakespeare. He uses, you can't even imagine, I have it in my book, the list, it's a whole long page list of how many literary references he uses to insult this geography professor in Switzerland, Herr Faute. But the big thing that he says about him, and this is, Marx's immaturity, but apparently Faute was a bit chubby. And so, the fat knight becomes Herr Faute. and just over and over and over and over and over. But he's spinning these ideas about Falstaff and Falstaff's lying, Falstaff's cheating. He's given money to create an army, but he creates an army of people who are half dead, so on and so on. So Herfaut is hilarious, but it's also deadly serious because it's Marx protecting the communists from the slanders of the counter-revolution. And Falstaff is the center of that.
Is this book still in publication?
Yeah, all this stuff, you can find it somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably have to go to some leftist bookstore, but yeah, it's there.
Yeah, this was the first time I've heard about Herfaut. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Another play that had an influence on Marx, and this is a lesser known play. It's not performed very often. And preparing for our conversation, I have not read it. I certainly have not seen it. It's actually hard to find. But I did go through some synopsis of it to try to figure it out before our chat. And this is I think you'd say Tymon of Athens.
That's it, Tymon of Athens. Yeah. So interestingly, Tymon of Athens is being performed much more now since Occupy, in the time of our knowledge about the problems of finance capital. It's becoming a lot more popular now. So Tymon is a philanthropist. He's in Athens, and he's a wealthy man. And for whatever reason, it doesn't say why, but for whatever reason, what he does is he puts on parties, and at the parties, he gives people money. He funds people. He buys jewelry from the jewelry, paintings from the painter, and so on and so forth. All right. So he has all these friends, in quotations, but they're not really his friends. They're parasites that come and get money from him. Then he has a steward called Flavius, and the steward comes along, and he says every once in a while, he says, "My lord," he says, "you're running out of money. Could you stop giving away money?" He says, oh, I'm wealthy and friends. And look, just sell another 40 acres. And look, sell my horses and give it to this guy. Sir, we already sold your horses, and we already sold all your land, And sir, the senators are coming to have some of their loans to you repaid. And he says, well, go ask this guy for some money, and go ask that guy for some money. And so he sends his servants out to ask his, quote, friends for money, and all of them say, oh, sorry, can't, gave it the office, can't do it. So it turns out that Tymon goes bust, and he realized that he has no friends, and all these people have just been parasitical. Yeah. And so then because
he needs help now, right? Because now he's in need, and no one's coming to help him. Yeah.
Exactly. So in the play, he turns from being a philanthropist to being a misanthropist. He leaves Athens, he goes outside into the woods, and he turns around and delivers a very long curse, one of the just most delicious curses in Shakespeare, where it's like, the walls of Athens fall, let the wolves come in and eat you. The young girls, let them be raped in their parents' eyes, just over and over and over, these like really difficult curses. Then he rips off his clothing, his Athenian clothing. Which in Germany allows the German actor to spend the second half of the play on stage naked. It's just kind of a common German Shakespearean thing. And now he goes out into the woods and he says, all right, I'm just going to eat roots, and that's it. So he starts digging for roots, and guess what he finds? Hidden gold. So he picks up the gold, and he holds it up to the sky, and he delivers a very long curse to gold. And in that, you could have imagined that he's sitting in 2022 in New York telling us everything that money has done. All the inversions, how it makes everything that's bad into good. It flips everything into its opposite. You could be ugly, but you can get a really hot girl because you got money, just over and over and over and over. And Marx picks up these set of lines and quotes them in all of his economic works. And peppers... in all of them, all the way through. He repeatedly quotes it and peppers many of his political works with ideas and imagery from Tymon of Athens. So that becomes a very important play for the economics. And it's in chapter 5 of my book in the economics section. I talk a lot about Tymon.
About his theories on money?
Yeah, really. I mean, it's so one of the things I say is that poets and philosophers have opposed money, have had a problem with money forever. I mean, all the way back to Homer, there are problems with, gold and money, right? And the Germans and the Romans and the Greeks, early British writers, Chaucer had a problem with money. All of these people are registering their problems with money, right? It becomes something, more or less scientific or critical in Marx's work. And Marx is quoting all of these people. He's quoting all the way back to Homer. He didn't quote Chaucer, but he's quoting all the way back to Homer on the problems with money. And Tymon's complaint about money is central to that.
Your chapter in which you write about Tymon of Athens, you include a letter from Jenny Marx. This is when, and it's about her experience and about the family's experience of being thrown out of an apartment in London.
Right.
And it's a very vivid, it's a long one. I was going to quote it, but it was pretty long, so I'm not going to. Yeah. But it's a very vivid thing that happens. They come in, they take all their possessions. I am paraphrasing here. You'll correct me if I get any of this wrong. They put everything out on the street. People come by, gawking at them, looking at them, start taking their stuff. I mean, it was a really profound quote from her in one of the letters. I guess she was writing to somebody about her experience of what had happened.
Right, exactly. So this is in Chelsea, in the Chelsea part of London, and I can get to that here. So they've moved into this flat, and it's too expensive for them because they don't have the money for it, and they're not making any money. And the other thing is that they're escaping the counter-revolution, but so are all the other Germans and French who had been in the revolution. So these other people are living with them, coming in and out, and Marx is trying to raise money for them so that people don't die and die of poverty. And, this is like it's like 1850, and it's a very poor time in London, okay? So they get kicked out of the flat, and all the stuff is put out in the street. And then the landlord comes by and he says, "Hey, that's my furniture. These German immigrants are stealing my furniture, and they're going to take it back to Germany," or to Prussia. I guess they're going to take it back to Prussia. And Marx says, no, that's not what's going on here. So then they have to bring all the stuff back in. At a certain point, they've got 300 people from Chelsea standing around watching this. Also, Jenny's son is breastfeeding at the time, and he's dying. And he ends up dying in the end. And he's sick, and there's blood running out of his mouth. So this whole scene is quite traumatic. And I started it because it's a real kind of down-to-earth scene about what poverty is like and how Karl Marx experienced that. From there, they ended up moving on to Dean Street in Soho. And you can see today, if you go to Soho, and you go to the number where he lived on Dean Street, you have to look up, and there's a blue plaque there above a restaurant, and it says Karl Marx lived here. And that's where they lived. They lost, I think, 2 of their children there to poverty. Very, very difficult place to live. It was just an attic with no running water, nothing, coal dust everywhere. And that's where he wrote some of his greatest works, was up in there.
Really interesting. I've been to Soho, and I've seen that plaque that you're talking about, and it's interesting because now it's just 100% gentrified, shops and bars everywhere, and and it was also interesting when I was reading that account in the chapter with this letter from Jenny. I just kept thinking wow, it really made the poverty that they lived in real, right? Because here you have this monumental figure, Karl Marx. The poverty was real, and that quote from that letter made that real to me. And the other thing I just kept thinking about, there are millions and millions of dollars made today off of Karl Marx's work.
Yeah, if he could see us now, huh?
How about other plays? I'm just throwing this one out there, The Tempest, because I think of it has been used to, in at least more modern times, used to show and produced in a way to show colonial and anti-colonial sentiments, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It didn't figure a lot into Marx. In fact, I think he may not even have quoted it. I write about it in my book because it's in a letter. It's in a letter from Jenny. Okay, that'll take me too long to find that, but I have the list here of everything he quoted. So what? Obviously, she saw it because she's using words from the play to talk about her own condition, and specifically from the character Ariel. Ariel's an earth spirit, and he's trapped into a tree, and then he's released from the tree by Prospero, the magician, the sort of philosopher magician. And Prospero keeps reminding him, I released you from the tree. And it's that speech from Prospero to Ariel that she quotes in her letter. But she's Ariel in the letter. She's trapped. And what she's trapped in is this, it's not so much that she's trapped in a female body, but she's trapped in a gendered exploitative situation where she's not allowed to go to school. Karl is over in Berlin studying, and she can't go study, and she really wants to. She doesn't want to sit home and sew, And the thing about Jenny is that she didn't stay home and sew because they got I guess you could say a maid, but it was really kind of a friend helper from her mother that stayed with them for their whole life, called Helen DeMuth. And that allowed, she took care of the kids a lot, and that allowed Jenny to work in the revolution. Jenny was organizing, she was writing, because Marx's handwriting, you can't read it. So most of what was sent to the publisher was written by Jenny. He worked with her theoretically. She gave him ideas. She was working with Heinrich Heine, helping him on his poetry. So she was quite active in revolutionary politics. And later in her life became a Shakespeare critic, writing for German papers about Shakespeare plays in London.
Probably can't overstate her role, Jenny and Marx's.
It's just not been understood as well as it should be. And I think some good feminist work on this needs to be done to bring out her role in this.
Hasn't been done yet?
I mean, it's in my book. So the first chapter really is, I think,
is about
the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And also other people who have written about Eleanor Marx. So for example, Rachel Holmes, other people have written about Jenny. There are a couple biographies of Jenny Marx. So yeah, there is some work being done, but I think it needs to be understood more.
You mentioned that when you first embarked on this project, your thesis was, was Shakespeare a Marxian or a Marxist? Yeah. I mean, obviously Shakespeare came first, but do you think he was theoretically?
I don't think that's how Shakespeare was thinking. I think what was happening is that Shakespeare was looking at the contradictions of his time. And he was taking those contradictions and, like a good writer, he compresses them into a shape that he then places in front of us on the stage. And it shocks us. It causes us to say, wow, that's a problem. And in that shock, then we can change. Then we can have a subjective change. So it was a very critical time in history, Shakespeare's time. And it was really only about, 20 years, or it was right around the turn of that century, the late Elizabethan time into the Jacobean time. Very critical time in history. Yeah.
What was critical about that? I mean, this is also a period of time where England had just separated itself from the Catholic Church. It would come back. I mean, this was a serious issue during Shakespeare's time. Yes.
The first joint stock company begins then. So the proto-capitalism begins then. Elizabeth is not so interested in war as she is interested in taking care of her people financially. She's, I don't know, could I compare her to Merkel maybe a little bit? She's like, I'm going to make sure that we're selling things, we're doing well, out in the market. And this was also a period at which modernity is getting started, and there's a fight between England and the Netherlands to see who's going to be the first hegemonic core country. And it's not England, because then England goes into the Civil War. So it ends up being the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is controlling commodity production at the time and the breadbasket of Europe and all of that. Elizabeth did the best she can to put it on the right footing. But there's also a transformation in art. She looks around and she says, I'm going to fund this guy, Shakespeare. So her Chamberlain funded Shakespeare. And then James funded Shakespeare directly. So they're going to fund Shakespeare to do this. They're going to fund new painters, new artists, new architects at the time. So a lot is changing artistically, culturally, economically, and politically during the early modern period.
And finally, what does Shakespeare, to you, say about Marxism?
So I think that Marxism is more literary than most people have taken him to be. I think we need to read him with fresher eyes. We need to open up to the multiple meanings in the way that Marx wrote and the way that he thought, because certainly Marx was thinking that way. Marx was always changing. There is no like set way of thinking about Marxism. I mean, that ends up leading towards Stalinism in the end. You know, I've always wondered, I'm living now in the part of Berlin that is in the East. And I've always wondered, had I lived here during the time of the GDR, would I have been imprisoned or made a professor? I'm not quite sure. I do know that the East German government, their Minister of Culture was a Shakespearean. And he was very interested in this question about Shakespeare's influence on Marx. But I think we need to read Marx with fresh eyes, with literary eyes, and open up what Marx was saying and look for multiple meanings. I don't want to use the word humanistic, but something a little bit more with humans at the center.
Christian Smith has been our guest. He's joined us for a conversation on his book, Shakespeare's Influence on Karl Marx, The Shakespearean Roots of Marxism. Christian Smith, I found that fascinating and quite interesting, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join me today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your interest and your questions. Bye-bye.